in Syria and Lebanon. With us to talk about it, Emma Suleiman, former spokesperson for the Syrian National Council based here in Paris. Ardavan, Amir Aslani, attorney and analyst. Retired Lebanese General Hicham Jaber is in Beirut. He is with the Middle East Center for Studies and Political Affairs. And from Doha in Qatar, which has been in the news today, we'll talk about that a little bit later on, David Roberts, lecturer at King's College in London. Before the break, we were talking about those shifting sands. There's first Russia, whether or not it's going to dig in its heels when it comes to Syria. Majority of our panel saying yes, in view of the worsening relations with the West right now. And we are talking now about this conference on Lebanon that's been taking place here in Paris. And Hicham Jaber was bemoaning the fact that there weren't many big announcements yet. Well, the one announcement we did get was confirmation of $3 billion worth of French weapons going to Lebanon to shore up its military. The $3 billion coming courtesy of Saudi Arabia. News reports say that the weaponry would prop up the Lebanese army to protect its borders better. Hicham Jaber, is this a good thing, the Saudis bankrolling the new equipment for the Lebanese army?
Of course. Lebanese army needs a lot of equipment, and this $3 billion are very important for Lebanon. Lebanese army has been for a long time, for decades, francophone, francophile, francisé. I was military attaché in Paris in the 90s, and we had a problem with spare parts with France. Then France was convinced to provide Lebanese army with spare parts at that time. And now we think French equipment for the army will be accepted, will be necessary for Lebanon, and we are trained already for the French equipment. But the question is, what kind of weapons France is ready to provide Lebanon? Everybody knows that Lebanese army needs sophisticated weapons, especially a defense system, which it doesn't have yet. And they need navy. We have 250 kilometers as a cost, and we don't have a real navy. The question, is France ready to provide Lebanon with missiles, air defense missiles, or land-sea missiles, or a sophisticated navy? I think many Lebanese, 90%, believe that France will not provide Lebanon with those sophisticated weapons.
That's certainly what reports here in Paris seem to be suggesting, and that's because it's with an eye towards anything that could be used against Israel. So with the weaponry, if it's of a more conventional, lower-grade type, Hicham Jaber, is it enough to protect the border with Syria?
No, let me tell you, before to move to Syria, Lebanon needs defense weapons, air defense weapons. The name, said that they are air defense. I don't think why Israel want to make a threat against Lebanon every day, and they will not let Lebanon have air defense system. Lebanon will not invade Israel, will not be offensive against any country. This is the problem, and I think the Lebanese government, I hope, will not be under the pressure and the influence of Israel and to forbid Lebanon to have what he needs. Otherwise, Lebanon has to look, has to accept this those French weapons, this Saudi grant, whatever it is, and try to collect money to buy those weapons from other countries, which are not under the Israel influence. That's clear. We were talking about it today in many mass media, and everybody believes that Lebanon, they are not very optimistic in Lebanon that they will get those weapons to protect the army, at least, against any invasion. And talking about Syria, now we have treaty with Syria. The relationship between Lebanon and Syria is very complicated. It's historical, it's geography, it's demography, it's economy. We have a trade, we have a transit through Syria. If Syria will close its borders with Lebanon, or the opposite, Lebanon will suffer. We have treaty with Syria. The Lebanese government has to deal with the Syrian government in order to avoid or to decrease, to avoid any problem or to decrease those damage.
So are you suggesting that, in other words, they don't need to have that new weaponry to help the army patrol the border?
Why not? For the army is equipped, of course. The army needs equipment in order to control the borders with Syria. We have 40 kilometers at least between Lebanon and Syria, those borders. We have 4 legal gates. We have at least 10 illegal gates. This border is not under control. We cannot count on the Syrians. They have fighting and war now in Al-Qalamun area. I think Lebanese army needs a lot of weapons to control its borders with Syria, of course. And also deterrence to forbid Israel, to attack Lebanon. That's it. I don't
Ardavan, let me bring in Ardavan Amir Aslani on this.
Of course, we have to side with General Jabber's. Any sovereign state should have whatever military equipment they deem necessary in order to assume their own security. But at the end of the day, the question we need to ask is, how much would $3 billion buy you today in the arms industry? Not much. I believe that he is right when he says that they're not going to get any air defense, they're not going to get aviation for that, they're not going to get a navy. They will probably get enhanced rifles and riot control operations and border patrol, because these $3 billion given won't buy much. And by the way, Lebanon apparently has already solved its security issue with Israel ever since Hezbollah positioned its troops on the Israeli side. So the Israelis are not going to contemplate anytime soon invading Lebanon again. That being said, who are the neighbors of Lebanon? It's Syria and Israel. Syria has one of the most sophisticated conventional armies in the Arab world, and the fact that they have managed to maintain control of the country despite this horrendous civil war that goes on is proof of that. And Israel is probably the most powerful army in the area. So these $3 million are not going to serve as deterrence for anyone. They, in my opinion, they seek to achieve 2 goals. Provide control over the million-plus refugees inside Lebanon and protect Lebanon's frontiers from the arrival on a chaotic basis of additional refugees. And maybe, and that's the Saudi influence over here, to try to up the capacity of the Lebanese army against Hezbollah. That's all it's going to achieve. It's not destined to go abroad. It's not destined to protect Lebanon against foreign countries. It's about law and order maintenance locally and maintaining a balance between Hezbollah and the Lebanese army. Grossly under-equipped compared to Hezbollah.
And how do you feel about the way it's set up? Do you agree with General Jaber? It's perfectly normal for it to be French weapons paid for by the Saudis.
Well, no. When the French president went to Riyadh, we heard the talks of $20 billion of contracts being signed between Saudis and the French. At the end of the day, we only ended up with these $3 billion that the French are supposed to get from the Saudis for the purposes of upping the Lebanese army. It's not going to be enough. And the fact that it's coming out of France is a consequence of the new alignment of the French foreign policy on the Saudis to the detriment of the Qataris. That's where it comes from.
Emma Suleiman.
I think I need to highlight, in my opinion, there is one point, not only regarding the weapons. We need to understand that the Lebanese army is biased, by the way. The intelligence unit at the Lebanese army is basically part of Hezbollah. So there is a risk that this weapon will reach Hezbollah. I think this is an important point to highlight. Second, to understand the background, why Saudi is now paying for, because it's paid by Saudi money. I think Saudi is following a U.S. established policy in the Middle East where they have to find or create a rival counterbalance to the Shiite alliance represented by Hezbollah, Iran, the Iraqi backed by Russia. So I believe this is the reason. This is the reason why. And plus, Saudi has to show its supporters in Lebanon that is doing something for them. The 14th of March now, it has to show that, okay, I'm working on helping the sovereignty of Lebanon. So this is why I'm helping the Lebanese army. So, and again, I think one more reason is to improve negotiation or a better deal for Saudi on the negotiation table whenever it takes place as well.
All right, the Saudis who've been making news this Wednesday they have recalled their ambassador to Qatar. So has the United Arab Emirates. The row with Qatar, which seemed to have been patched up last November, differences over the over most notably, according to Abu Dhabi-based newspaper The National. Once again, they were upset apparently last Friday with a sermon on Qatari-based TV, Al Jazeera, by controversial preacher Yusuf Al-Qaradawi. But more broadly, the argument over which attitude towards the Muslim Brotherhood. David Roberts, I guess you're in the eye of the storm there in Doha. People there are surprised by what's happened this Wednesday?
It's a very significant step. It's a very public step. It's not entirely unsurprising. As you suggest, in late January, there was a sermon given by Yusuf Al-Qaradawi. He's based in Doha, has been since 1961, broadcast on TV. It wasn't very flattering towards the Emirati government. This produced a storm on social media and so on, but that was calmed down quite quickly. He's an old gentleman. He wasn't at the pulpit for a couple of weeks. People thought that that was maybe part of a government reaction. But when he came back just a couple of weeks ago, he again resumed a confrontational line, essentially. And this, you know, it's added to this. I mean, we cannot really point to one particular issue of concern. There's no smoking gun, if you will, that Qatar did X and Y and it led to some particular issue. This is more of, you know, accumulation of issues. And as it's sort of been alluding to throughout this conversation, it's fundamentally about the different positioning strategies, if you will, that occur in the Gulf. Qatar, it is a Wahhabi country itself. That's its particular form of Islam, just like Saudi Arabia. But for a number of years now, a number of decades now, they have been in many ways cultivating links with numerous members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they've been useful in a fashion for Qatar during the Arab Spring. And this is the basic sort of dichotomy, which is at the heart of this relationship.
David, I have to ask you on this point. Last year, the Emir of Qatar stepped down in favor of his son, and the new Emir, when Sheikh Tamim became the new Emir, people, and actually, Ardavan, you were here when we were discussing it. They were saying, "Oh, this is going to be a change of stance on the part of the Qataris." Has anything changed?
Not really. In terms of foreign policy, at least, we haven't seen Amir Tamim either assiduously push the previous foreign policy or stop it, if you will. What Qatar has been doing in the last 9 months, it's been the policy has continued with momentum, if you see what I mean. I mean, in terms of whether Tamim would or could change things, I would suggest fundamentally not. His father is still around. I mean, I don't think he's looking over his shoulder at every meeting, but anything like that. But nevertheless, I think for Amir Tamim, 33-year-old, the new Amir, in his first few months, I think it's implausible that he could have overturned a trend in Qatari policy, which we've seen very visibly in the past few years. But this trend has been here for decades, basically. The Ikhwan links stem back to the late 50s and the 60s, as I say. So it's much more difficult to overturn that kind of a link. And just 2 points very briefly, if I can. It has been relatively useful for Qatar, augmenting its importance in creating the transnational links. Of course, this has backfired at times. And secondly, one of the original reasons that they pursued this policy in the first place was to augment a certain difference, if you will, between Saudi and Qatar. So it's important for two reasons which aren't going to change overnight.
All right. Of course, for people who don't follow the intricacies of what's going on in the Gulf, it's kind of hard to follow when you bring it back to what's going on inside of Syria, because they seem to, at certain times over the past 3 years, to always be supporting some of the same groups that are fighting in Syria.
Not always, not always. Egypt is the case study in this matter. We should not forget that the Muslim Brotherhood, who won the elections with President Morsi, the first democratically elected president in Egyptian history, when he came to power, he had the absolute support of the Qatari government, who ended up giving a loan of $5 billion to maintain the regime. And then what happened? The ex-military attaché of the Egyptian embassy in Saudi Arabia in Riyadh, General al-Sisi, was backed by the Saudis, organized the coup, and took over Egypt. What they did do was immediately to disband the Muslim Brotherhood and create all the fuss that we have encountered ever since. So you have two different versions of Islam, Sunni Islam, that are fighting against each other. You've got the Muslim Brotherhood with its international ramifications, and that's what bothers the Saudis and the UAE government, is because the Muslim Brotherhood has, in each of these countries, a presence. The UAE government had to arrest dozens of Muslim Brotherhood affiliates in Abu Dhabi and put them in jail and put them on trial because of their affiliation with this movement. The same thing is true in Saudi Arabia. However, the Saudis support and defend another version of radical Islam, that of the Salafi movement, that of the Wahhabi Takfiri movement, which basically speaking are the most extreme versions of Islam. And the different Islamic groups that are fighting against each other, the Islamist opposition in Syria, are representatives of these different groups. Al-Qaeda represents the Salafist movement. You have the Islamic State of Levant that represents the Wahhabi version.
That's not how the Saudis put it, of course.
Yeah,
and that's not how the Qataris put it.
They put it differently.
They say that their governments don't sponsor the jihadists.
No, but where does the money come from? Where does the ammunition come from? When the Qatari sheikh showed up in Hamas in Gaza, the next day they began shooting at Israel. So they can say today that they're behind these scopes.
Yeah, but Saudi Arabia forbid now, since a month, they issued a new law where they forbid Saudi jihadis to go in Syria or any other.
But that's where
place.
they're fighting today. You may forbid people
but
from
they're
leaving,
not
but you know they're there.
They're not. Saudi does not sponsor the radicals. The Saudi government. I'm talking about the Saudi government. While other parties, radical parties in Saudi Arabia, finance the radical elements in Syria. However, the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, which you mentioned,
ISIS, as it's called.
ISIS or ISIL, I think now it's called because it's Levant, was not supported by the Saudis. Were supported by fundamentals in Kuwait.
Okay. Now, what you're saying is that the Saudi government is not officially involved. However, Saudi individuals and Saudi interest groups are financing them. But at the end of the day, scholars financing, armed groups. But at the end of the day, what we're witnessing is that you have money coming from Wahhabi countries such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other Persian Gulf Arab countries funneled into different Sunni version Islamic groups in Syria fighting against each other. It's about power, and it's about the control of the opposition in Syria.
Right,
it's about Egypt. It's a cross-border multi-jurisdiction issue over here.
All right, let me bring in Hicham Jaber. Hicham, this argument that's going on in the Gulf Peninsula, among the Gulf states, are you going to feel the effects of it in Lebanon and in Syria?
Yes, in Syria, yes. In Lebanon, I don't think, because the Qataris don't have that influence in Lebanon as they have influence in some Islamic jihadistic group in Syria. But let me give you my opinion about the conflict between the Gulf countries. Everybody knows that Saudi Arabia was not very happy to see the role of Qatar, which was given to Qatar in the last decade, which is at least 20% bigger than Qatar's size. And Saudi Arabia did not recognize easily, that a country called Qatar, like the same case between Syria and Lebanon. Lebanon was independent in 1943. After 60 years, Syria did recognize independent country called Lebanon, and we started to have diplomatic relations. The same thing, I don't think Saudi Arabia, with its influence on the other countries in the Gulf, will admit that Qatar play alone, and that is the reason, in my opinion, whether Muslim Brotherhood or not, Saudi Arabia was always, looking at the Muslim Brotherhood with suspicious, but they did have relation with Morsi when they arrived to the power. Now, I think the United Arab Emirates and the others in Saudi Arabia, they did consider Sheikh Qardawi, very dangerous man, and is against their belief and their policies. That is the interior conflict between the Gulf countries, and one side Saudi Arabia and the other side Qatar. I think Qatar will admit at the end of the day and will take its role convenient or equivalent to its size at least.
All right, so at the end of the day, you're saying Qatar will be humble. David Roberts, what do you see as this knock-on effect for what's going on in Syria, and does it, at the end of the day, strengthen Assad's hand?
I'll definitely come on to that, but just to sort of add to a point of the previous speaker, this Saudi-Qatari dynamic of a small state and a much larger one, of course, this is to a degree a bit of an older conflict, if you will. This was absolutely the fundamental dynamic of the difficulty between the two states in the early 90s. It crystallized in 1995 when Hamad bin Khalifa took power, and so on and so on. This led to, Saudi withdrew their ambassador for Qatar unilaterally, just themselves, in 2002, and the ambassador only returned in 2008. He returned in 2008 primarily because, so to phrase it, they did come to terms with the concept of Qatar as a small state. They realized that after all these years, since the bitter conflict of the early 90s, that there wasn't much they could do about it. Today, we have this as the background, absolutely. But what we have, as I think the previous speaker also mentioned, you have a very serious security dynamic added on to this as another layer, particularly in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, but obviously also in Manama these days. In addition to, you have this concern of Qatar not supporting what is seen undoubtedly as not existential, but as extraordinarily serious security issues, if you will. And they see Qatar as just not understanding this, and this is some of the issue there. And look, just going forward, looking forward rather, well, Emir Tamim and Qatar is in a very difficult position. I cannot back down in the face of this. That's just not very plausible, I would have thought. So I presume that what we'll have to do is, under the table, whatever the phrase is, informally, in private, signify or suggest that indeed he is taking on these deep concerns, if you will, as signified by this very unusual step of taking all three, unusual and public step, of taking all three ambassadors away. And perhaps one of the ways that we will see this is with a certain change of Qatari support in Syria. Exactly understanding how that will happen and when that happens, and empirically proving that is basically impossible, but it's plausible, certainly.
Amir Suleiman, at the end of the day, will this strengthen the hand of Bashar al-Assad, since the backers of those who have weapons are fighting amongst each other? Definitely,
of course. This only works for the interest of Bashar, and I think that Bashar is probably partying today with what's going on, because but again, we at the opposition, we're divided between those who are pro Qatar and those who are pro Saudi or whatever. Personally, I'm not aligned with any of their agendas, because for us, for me personally, Saudi will back up, will replace a dictator by another, like they did in Egypt, and it's a total counter-revolution. Although I wasn't for the Muslim Brothers at all, or I wasn't for Morsi. And at the same time, Qatar is supporting the fundamentals, and then we have the Qatari camp at the opposition. So I think having both sides interference and the opposition was very positive. It was very negative and had negative effects on the opposition itself and on the revolution. So, but today this will result in more fighting among the opposition and the rebel themselves, and this is not good at all, of course.
All right, not a positive necessarily. Outcome, at least hopefully, though cooler heads will prevail. I want to thank you, Amir Suleiman, for joining us. Ardavan, Amir, Aslani, Hicham Jaber for being with us from Beirut, and in Doha, David Roberts. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. Much more news to come at the top of the hour.
Reporters. Over 3 million refugees have had to choose between the hell of war in Syria or exile. Most have fled to neighboring countries, but every day, hundreds